We should, as liberals, be thinking about how can we protect and preserve and develop a society based on democratic and liberal values, not on any accidental set of values. Thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion. I think it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Friedrich Naumann Foundation, in all my political life, has always been sort of at the forefront, fighting for freedom and democracy. I'm also here as the Vice President of ALDE and speaking on behalf of ALDE. And it'd be a pleasure for me to make a statement on behalf of ALDE. And I must say I'm particularly happy and honored to be here with some of the people who made me a Vice President of ALDE. So thank you so much. Well, basically, security policy could be a non-politically term for the aim to protect and preserve the sovereignty of any country, or indeed, as we're talking about today, Eastern Europe. As such, security policy is a concern of every country, be that Russia, Iran, India, my own country, Denmark, or Ukraine. And one could think of a multitude of tools that could be employed for the purpose of security policy. Military strength, think of the United States. Aggressive attitudes, think of Russia. Or defensive isolation, think of Japan. Or ideological oppression of your own people, think of North Korea. So any nation will have its own important concerns about security and define its own security policy. The issue of security policy will therefore be of great importance and relevance to any country, be it a communist country, an Islamist country, a nationalist, totalitarian, or even a democratic country. However, I'm a liberal, and as such, to me, a discussion about security policy must involve a more elaborate and complicated task. We're not just talking about how we can protect a certain number of people on a certain piece of land. We should, as liberals, be thinking about how can we protect and preserve and develop a society based on democratic and liberal values, not on any accidental set of values. Now, we are gathered here at FNF conference, and as I said, I'm here as a representative of ALDE and as a member of Venstre, the Liberal Party in Denmark. So when we want to exchange views on the new security policy of Europe, what we should discuss is not merely how can the territorial integrity of the Ukraine or Southeast Europe be preserved. One might argue that such a narrow discussion on security policy could have been limited to a gathering of very capable experts on military tools, capacities and alliances, and not broad political agendas. No, because we are liberals, and as liberals we want to build societies which offer citizens a life in freedom, a life where citizens are allowed the pursuit of happiness, as the writers of the American Declaration of Independence would have formulated it. A life where social dignity is observed and for all citizens, and as all true European liberals would demand. We liberals are signatories to what has become known as the liberal world order after World War II. It has embraced liberal democracy, self-determinations of people, industrial capitalism, secular nationalism, open trade, human rights, and the rule of law. This is the system which is being challenged today. We liberals, of course, realize that we must make sure that such liberal societies are able to defend themselves from threats abroad, threats from countries and politicians who typically do not feel restricted by the same limitations which we as liberals put on our own actions and our own societies. To put it another way, how can we as liberals create and preserve free and liberal societies even when we are faced by economic crisis at home and abroad? How can we deal with the understandable but unrealistic desire of millions of poor Arabs and Africans who wants to get their share of the wealth of Europe and their share of European ways of life? And how should we deal with the militant Islamist, nuclear armed rogue states like North Korea or Iran? Or how should we deal with aggressive and totalitarian expansionists like Putin's Russia? What are the internal characteristics of such a liberal society which we should seek to protect through our security policy? Well, first of all, a society must be based on all the fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. I'll not give you an exhaustive account, but we're talking about the freedom of expression, the right to assemble, the right to travel, the right to vote in secrecy, protection from government interference into your personal life, respect for property rights, the right to choose one's religion, the right to choose one's partner and to live according to one's sexual orientation, etc. But there will also have to be a democratic superstructure, the institutions which come on top of individual rights and freedom. I'm thinking of the division of power, between the legislative and executive authorities and an independent judiciary. The freedom of the press and the right to take part in meaningful democracy, that is, the right of the majority to throw out the president or parliament and perhaps carry through a peaceful transition of power. We need the rule of law. We need transparency in public affairs, and we need to fight consistently against corruption. All this make up the internal fabric of an individual country which wants to be seen as a liberal democracy. In the EU, these shared values have been combined with economic liberalism, which have tied these countries together. As an EU citizen, one enjoys four freedoms, four economic freedoms: the movement of labor, the movement of goods, the movement of services, and the movement of capital. Societies based on these democratic values and economic ideas will never be a threat to any of their neighbors. Germany, for example, has not behaved aggressively towards any of its neighbors for more than 70 years. Neither has my own country, Denmark, for that sake. However, even liberal democracies have to care about their national security, since they may well be surrounded by countries that do not share our liberal values and visions. Take, as an example, South Korea in relation to North Korea, Taiwan in relations to communist China, or even more relevant in our part of the world, the relations between the Baltic states and Russia. But it's almost self-evident that non-aggressive liberal democracies should come together to shield themselves from outside threats as part of their security policy. This is the rationale behind NATO. It is also a rationale behind the emerging idea that the EU should put more emphasis on shared interests in the field of security policy. So countries can band together and share their common security interests. And I'll argue that countries based on liberal democratic values in most cases will have an interest in combining their security policy considerations and their military capacity so that they can increase the national security of each and every one of the countries. As such, I believe that under most general terms, the combination of the democratic quality of the EU and the military commitments of NATO is as close as any country can get to guarding its security in the Europe of our time. Today, you'll find that a high number of European countries enjoy the security which can be found in the membership of both unions and alliances. And I understand perfectly well that such a dual membership can seem very attractive to any country facing threats and isolation on its own, perhaps in the light of threatening behavior of its neighbors. And the Ukraine could be a very, very relevant example of such a country. However, there are unfortunately a number of reasons why invitations to join either NATO or the EU can be difficult to issue. And we now enter what we could call the brutal realm of reality in which we live. The vicious world where some characteristics of a country prevent it from receiving the unambiguous label of being a democracy, and the world where security political choices cannot be made without a pragmatic view as to the realities of the political and military theater surrounding any given country. Countries like my own Denmark and Holland enjoyed the privileges of being founding members of NATO. Holland even enjoyed being a founding member of the EU. The historical, the political, and the security circumstances allowed the Dutch to join both of these attractive clubs right from the start. Others have had to wait for their turn. Denmark became a member of the EU when it was a well-established community. And Denmark could join because it managed to fulfill all the conditions which must be fulfilled for membership. We could join NATO as well as the EU at a time and under circumstances which did not give rise to any serious economic or security policy repercussions. Now take Sweden and Finland. They joined EU long after it was established. But even after the Berlin Wall came down, both countries decided to bide their time and pass by the open window of NATO membership. The reality of the world, of Europe and of the Nordic region is such that this open window probably has been closed for Sweden and Finland. An application for membership from these countries to NATO would cause serious drama in relation to Russia. Take another example. Turkey became a member of NATO without being anywhere near a democracy. Even NATO has to be pragmatic, a pragmatic player. And Turkey became a member of NATO because the political risk to NATO of letting Turkey drift in whichever direction was too much of a risk, a serious risk for the NATO alliance. But Turkey these days is far from bringing itself in a position where it can enjoy membership of NATO as well as the EU. Actually, in my view, Turkey is even pretty much becoming a political democratic embarrassment for NATO. But the relations between Turkey, NATO, and the EU just underline that the world cannot be governed by our liberal and idealistic dreams alone. There is a harsh reality out there which we have to face. The Baltic countries, Bulgaria, Romania, to name a few, joined both EU and NATO. They did not miss the window which history and NATO and EU had opened up. And today, these countries, like other Central and Eastern European countries, have experienced and enjoyed the privileges of communities made up of NATO and the EU. It would definitely be in the interest of the EU and of NATO and of Ukraine to try to create the circumstances where Ukraine, just like Holland, Denmark, or the Baltic countries, could enter the European and transatlantic fellowships. But such a development must involve a number of vital changes. First of all, Ukraine must make a successful effort to evolve into a fully democratic society with all the liberal liberties and all the social fabric that I mentioned at the outset of my presentation here today, and which must be observed if you want to become a member of the EU. And I know this is a daunting task. The eradication of corruption and the introduction of the rule of law took decades in most countries, including my own, but it has to be done. And it is a task which the political establishment of Ukraine must come together to solve. Political leadership is indispensable, and the Ukrainians must do it on their own. Others cannot lift this responsibility. However, the EU and my own country should stand beside Ukraine and assist in any way possible. For example, through the anti-corruption program, of which my own country is deeply involved in. The very serious military issues and the completely unacceptable Russian annexation of the Crimea and the invasion into eastern Ukraine and the help to the so-called rebels are very unpleasant proofs of the real world in which we are living. NATO, the EU, and particularly Germany and France through the Normandy process, must put all possible and necessary pressure on Russia. We have to realize that the security for Ukraine must be established before we can walk down the path which one day could allow the Ukraine, if it chooses, to get more formal and well-functioning relationships to NATO and to the EU. And by the way, as liberals, we should never accept in our political view or in our idealistic dreams nothing apart from the Ukrainians being able to themselves to decide whether they should someday seek membership of NATO and or the EU. But as I have reminded myself and you several times already, we live in a cruel world which prevents us from enjoying the democratic societies in a military secure environment. Even the American President Trump has created intolerable insecurity about the American international values and the American commitment to the spirit and obligations of NATO. Uncertainty is one of the worst ingredients anyone can introduce into a volatile international environment where several actors have no reservations in taking advantage of the weakness or the indecisions of others, such as Russia, as has already been mentioned. The decision of Brexit severely threatens the international weight of the EU and indeed of Britain, which may very well end up like a Singapore-like city-state with an impoverished hinterland of Wales and Northern England. Turkey is drifting towards a totalitarian future with an unknown mission towards the Middle East and Russia, and further away from the EU than ever. It could very well be argued, and I will argue, that in this situation, the EU and Ukraine share so many common interests. The security of Europe could be enhanced by a stable and secure Ukraine, which has found its rightful place in the European and North Atlantic family. Ukraine has a well-educated and hard-working population which could contribute so much to the future political development and the future prosperity of Europe. I hope that our conversations here today and tomorrow can contribute to building the foundation of such a development. Thank you.